Okay. So we have our special guest presenter starting today. Today we have Tess Mccarthy. She is presenting on hand movements in Braille. I'll do a more appropriate introduction in a few minutes, but I see we have a hand raised. Susie Chance, if you guys need something, you can type in the chat. That will be the easiest way to communicate with us. You want to make sure that you are, let me advance my slide here. So, I do want to remind you, we have closed captioning available. That should be a feature that you can see in your Zoom menu bar. It might say live transcripts. And so going back to that chat box, make sure that in there next to the 2, you click on the drop down and change it so that it says all panelists and attendees. So everyone can see your questions, your comments, your thoughts, your answers, and I will be relaying those to our presenter. So we do have handouts available for this presentation. It is located on the web page for this event on our website. So in the agenda for this event, all of the links are embedded within there. So you want to open that agenda file and you'll see the links for the handouts, and we are recording. So then the recording link will go on that file as well. So I will post that link in just a few minutes here for anyone who is still looking for those. And then next week, all of these sessions will be moved to the past events page of our website. So keep an eye out for that. We are offering in-service and ACDREP credit for our webinars this week. We've had some all week long. In case you've missed any, go back and check out the recording. But the opening code for this session that you want to take a note of is scissors, like scissors that you cut with. So you're gonna keep that handy, and I will tell you at the end of the session what to do with that information. And so on to what you all have been waiting for. We have Tess Mccarthy. She is from the University of Pittsburgh, and she is going to be presenting More Than Meets the Eye, a detailed analysis of Braille hand movements, which was actually, I believe this is a version of a presentation that was given at Getting in Touch with Literacy last year that some of our FIMC staff were able to see. And it was such a great presentation that we were fortunate enough to have Tess present this to us here in Florida and anyone else who happens to be joining us. So with that, I am going to stop sharing and turn it over to our fabulous presenter.
Thanks for those kind words, Liz.
You're welcome.
Here, folks, I looked through the participant list and had a chance to see that there are some familiar faces here, or at least familiar names. I guess we can't see each other's faces. But anyway, let me get my screen going here. Okay, and there's one thing I want to check out.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, here we go. And I am making sure. Okay, so it's going to be difficult for me to see the chat panel while I'm sharing this. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that if anybody has any pressing questions, feel free to put those in the chat box. And Liz, if you would be willing to just jump in and throw those out, I'm happy to jump in and talk about questions and kind of keep this a little casual as we go.
Mm-hmm. Of course, yes.
Okay, so everybody can see my screen, right? The PowerPoint?
Yeah.
And everybody can hear me, right?
I am able to hear you, yes.
Awesome. So let's start talking about this stuff. So I am so excited to talk to you guys about this because this is a topic that I think is incredibly interesting. And my goal is that by the time we finish, if you don't already think this is a fascinating topic, that you will. So let's go ahead and jump in with part one. So we're going to do this presentation today in 3 parts. Part one, I just sort of want to give you the big why of why does this matter? Why do the mechanics of hand movements when you read Braille matter? And The second part of this is really going to be an opportunity to dive into the literature and look at the importance of hand movements. And I'm going to talk about some of the research that I'm currently working on. I'll review some of the research that we did with the ABC Braille study several years ago now. It's amazing how time flies. I can't believe that study's been as many years ago as it was now. And then we'll talk about some more recent research that Rob Wall Emerson and I have been working on, and then sort of where the goals are for that research to go in the future. And then part 3 is just going to be a super let's get practical and talk about what do these data mean in the real grand scheme of things. Like, why am I doing this? And hopefully in that section, you'll come away with some tips that you think are really helpful to change the way that you might think about mechanics when you're talking about Braille. Okay, so I've called part 1, why do you stare at people's hands when they read, you weirdo? So I first got roped into this topic when I was working, I was a doctoral student. I just started at Vanderbilt University. And Diane Wormsley was one of the research team members. And Diane was kind enough to offer me an internship where I went to North Carolina Central University, where she was at the time. And I was able to spend the summer working with her, which was a wonderful mentorship opportunity. But what I primarily was doing was coding videos of little kids' hands as they read Braille. So it was really Diane that got me super interested in this topic. That would have been like the summer of 2007. So I guess it is a little bit weird, but I love watching people when they read Braille because the way they move their hands tells you so much. Okay, so let's dive right into the big why. So why on earth would I spend from 2007 up till now staring at people's hands when they read Braille? Well, it really goes back to the literacy levels of our students. And I'm going to be talking a lot about reading speeds. And I just want to throw this out as a caveat that I don't think speed is the only important piece when it comes to reading. There are so many important pieces when we're talking about literacy for our students, and speed is just one variable. But I want to take a look at some published data on reading speeds. A lot of times people will ask me if I have any data on reading speeds and what we think our students should be reading and what typically sighted peers who read print are reading. And your handout document that you got does not, it follows the presentation, but it doesn't look exactly like the presentation. This is optimized for presenting, and your all's document is optimized for note taking. With that said, at the very back, there's an appendix that has 4 different pages, and on those 4 pages are these charts. So you don't have this in the front matter of your handout, but don't worry about that. This is just to give you the opportunity to sort of see why we're looking at this. So don't get too hung up on the numbers in this moment, but you do have a copy of all of these data in your handouts, so you can always refer back. So this is actually an article that was taken from the ABC Braille study. This particular paper was by Rob Wall Emerson, Kay Holbrook, and Frances Mary DeAndrea. And what he did was it took reading speeds from Hasbrook and Tyndall, which were published in 2006. And to be completely honest, I'm not exactly sure why they used Hasbrook and Tyndall as their reference. I think it had something to do with the way that the data was spaced out over time, like we did with ABC Braille, that made it a nice comparison. But you see that in the ABC Braille study, the students were reading in first grade a range of 16 words per minute to 48 words per minute. And the average reading speed for our Braille readers was about 34 words per minute. The oral reading fluency for sighted students at the 50th percentile, so for typically sighted peers that are reading in the 50th percentile, their average reading speed would be 53 words per minute. So our average is significantly below where a student that's at that 50th percentile would be. And where do our students land? You know, compared with typical peers in this study, our students were landing at the 25th to 50th percentile. So in second grade, once again, we see a similar trend. The range of reading speeds was 19 to 89 words per minute. And I just want to point out that like kids that are getting up to 89 at the top end of this range, 89 words per minute, that's pretty fast for a second grader. So we do have some students that are reading at the same speeds as their typically sighted peers who are reading print, but we have some students that really aren't. So our average was 47.52 words per minute, and the average for sighted peers was about 90 words per minute. Our students dropped from the 25th percentile, 25th to 50th percentile to the 10th to 25th percentile. And the trends just continue from there. Third grade, our students are reading 21 to 86 words per minute. The average was 53 words per minute. And right there, we're right at about half what their typically sighted peers who are in the 50th percentile are reading. So our students are coming in at the 10th to 25th percentile. And in fourth grade, once again, we see the same trend. And if anything, our students are just falling further behind with an average reading speed of 15 to 115 words per minute, 62 words per minute being the average, and 123 words per minute being the average for a student that's at that 50th percentile. And our students were generally speaking performing below the 10th percentile. So this isn't where we want our students, right? I mean, they're not comparing very favorably on this measure of reading speed. Keeping in mind, reading speed is not all there is to it. So this is another table that was taken from the ABC Braille study. This is from the Hand Movements project that I worked on with Diane Wormsley and Cheryl Kamei-Hannon. And so we have some more information about reading speeds on students. I won't go through this in quite as much detail, but once again, the averages are very comparable. The average reading speed for kindergarten was not quite 20 words per minute. The average reading speed for fourth grade was only 50 words per minute. And if you look at our maximum rates, we do have students who are reading on par with typical peers. So this is definitely something they can be doing. But we also see a lot of students who are reading very, very slowly. Once again, this is a third table for you. This was just published a few months ago this year. This is out of a different project that had to do with it's had a couple different names, but the iBraille Challenge app, Reading Adventure Time. It is a app for iPad that it's meant to be not only it's meant to be a way that you can test your students over time, but it's also got like a lot of fun games and curriculum to it. It's turned into a couple of different projects. I know at least one of those is currently down, but we're hoping to get that back up and running. It's so hard with this technology to keep things constantly updated and up to pace. But with this, what was the name? Oh, I can see the chat box now. So what was the name of the app? Okay, so it's had two names. It's actually split into two apps. One is called iBraille Challenge app, and that's owned by the Braille Institute now. It is a pared back version of the app that mostly just has the reading passages, and it's meant to help students get prepared for the iBraille Challenge. The other app is called Reading Adventure Time. That is the one that is unfortunately down right now, but we're hoping that it will be up again at some point in the future. And the Reading Adventure app is meant to be something that you work with the teacher, with the students, and it's got all these curriculum type activities. It's not a curriculum, but it's got lots of practice activities. But as we were doing this is some new data. The other stuff is actually getting pretty old. But once again, we're really finding that our students are reading at about the same rates. So our apprentice level students, which are our youngest students, so we have information from this study about how they were reading literary texts, expository texts, so fiction texts, nonfiction informational texts, and then how fast they were reading when they were reading orally. So we're seeing that our youngest students averaging about 19 words per minute on literary, about 14 words per minute On expository, we can round that up to 15 words per minute, and oral reading is about 19 words per minute. Our freshman category, they're getting faster, but they sort of level off after this grade. So we're getting, 42 words per minute, about 46 words per minute, and about 57 words per minute. Sophomore, very similar reading speeds. So about 55 words per minute, about 45 words per minute, and about 51 words per minute. So the junior varsity level, these students were actually a little bit slower. We've got 39 words per minute, 29 words per minute, and 17 words per minute. The last category is the varsity students. And these reading speeds are correct, but I'm going to tell you to ignore them because although they are technically correct, they are misleading. These students were, when we went back and did a line-by-line analysis, although these were the reading rates of 320 words per minute and 220 words per minute, it was really, that was not capturing really what the student was doing. And if anybody wants to know nitty-gritty details about research, I'll go into that later. So while these data are correct and they are published, they're a little misleading. So kind of ignore those. But the oral reading is a more accurate depiction of how quickly these students were reading. And it was about 40 words per minute. So think about this. Varsity level, these are our students who are about to graduate from high school. These are our oldest students that are about to graduate from high school. 40 words per minute. That's pretty slow for somebody who's about to graduate from high school when we think about functionally using literacy. Okay, and then these are data that are not yet published. This is part of a manuscript that's in preparation. The note in your handout says that these are draft data, and I ask you to please not distribute these. It's not because I don't think these data are correct. And one second, I just saw a question pop up in the chat box. I'll get to that in just a second. These data are correct, but I'm asking that you don't distribute this information yet just because it's not published yet. So you're getting a little sneak peek. But this, once again, is data in different conditions. So, and you can see we don't have a ton of students, particularly in varsity and apprentice. But it's going to give you reading speeds for silent words per minute. There's the average plus the range. So the average was about 17 words per minute and 9 to 22 words per minute. Literary was very similar. I'm not going to go through all these numbers, but they're very, very, very much on target with what we've been seeing. So different types of silent reading passages. We've got word speeds for different types of oral passages and the number of miscues students were making. So I see that the question is, how does this compare to sighted students, and how do the Braille students' reading levels change when you, okay, with the difficulty of the material and whether or not it's in contracted or uncontracted. Okay, so those are good things to talk about. And that's the big, to an extent, that's getting at the big why. So the big why is our students are reading way too slowly. So when we look at these numbers, so like I said, like about an oral reading speed of approximately 40 words per minute for students who are about to leave high school. The average oral reading speed for an adult is about 150 words per minute. The average silent reading speed for an adult is about 300 words per minute. So if we're comparing oral reading speeds, our students that were in that varsity level reading about 40 words per minute, when their typically sighted adult peers are reading at about 150 words per minute orally. So that's a huge difference. We saw in the Hasbrook and Tyndall comparison that our children were doing at about the 10th percentile compared with typical peers. And then when we look at that extrapolated data with these more recent studies, we're seeing that their students really aren't picking up speed as they get older. I would caution you though, I wouldn't make too many direct comparisons between typically sighted peers and typical peers, because it's a different skill. It's a different skill, it's performed differently, there are certain limitations. But we're going to talk about that today, and we're going to talk about how we can capitalize on that. So basically, while I don't think reading speed is the only measure of reading proficiency, I think reading fluency is typically measured as speed, accuracy, and prosody. Prosody is reading with expression, which is a measure of comprehension. You know, you can't read a passage with expression if you don't understand it. And typically when we look at measures of comprehension, our students do pretty well. Our students understand what they read. Even when you do a passage, like think about if you've done an informal reading inventory, like the Johns, and you have them read the passage and answer the questions. I know you guys have all had the experience of having a student who stumbles through it and has like 5 billion miscues, and you're like, there's no way this student got this passage. They are like beyond the frustration level on the Johns. But then you get to the comprehension questions and they get them all right. I think in measures like that, our students are much better readers than we give them credit for. I think part of it is they're so used to experiencing the world in puzzle pieces and then fitting it together that they've just gotten really good at that skill. So that's how they can have all these miscues in a passage, and then when you test comprehension, they still understand it, even though they technically aren't supposed to, given their reading speed and how many miscues they had. So I think that I don't want to take away from our students, but when it comes to speed, our students are not measuring up. And while I do caution us from making so many comparisons between print readers, just because it is a different skill in a lot of ways, it does concern me because this impacts the quality of life. So if you think about it, if your reading is taking you at least twice as long as your typical peers, that means your homework is probably taking you at least twice as long. So that means when your friends are out playing in the neighborhood and getting to know each other and working on those social skills and that social emotional learning and those recreation and leisure skills, our students are stuck at home still trying to get through their homework because their reading speed is so much slower. This reading speed, when you go out into the workplace, how can you compete for a job when it's going to take you twice as long? You know, if your job requires a lot of literacy, how are you supposed to compete for the same job when it's going to take you twice as long to get everything done? Because your reading levels are so much slower than your peers. So this is my big why. This is why I care about how people move their hands when they read Braille, is because I want our students to have a better shot at equity. I want our students to be able to get their homework done in the same amount of time so they can go out and learn all those outside of academic school skills in their neighborhood with their peers. I want them to have rich lives. I want them to have the jobs they want. And I know that's what you want for your students too. So that's why you should be just as interested in this stuff as I am. So anyway, the big why is our students are reading too slowly. And what can we do about it? And in my mind, there are 3 big things that we can do to intervene and make this a better situation for our students. One has to do with the mechanics. So we have a real advantage when it comes to Braille readers that we don't have with sighted readers. So when it comes to sighted readers, your eyes are doing a lot of the same things that hands are doing. You just don't have the ability to control your eyes, and you're less aware of what they're doing. I do think that a lot of times Braille readers similarly don't know exactly what their hands are doing when they're reading, even if they think they do. Not that I fault anyone for that. I have no clue what my eyes do when I read, except for I've read studies about what my eyes do when I read. And those weren't studies of my eyes, those were studies of other people's eyes. So I guess my eyes do the same thing. But I think that by watching the mechanics, we can teach our students how to capitalize on how to control their hand movements. We have the ability for something called joint attention, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. And I think that mechanical advantage that we have with the joint attention of our hands is a big advantage that print readers don't have. And I want to understand the mechanics of how Braille readers move their hands so that I can come up with ways to improve efficiency. The second thing that I think we really can do to intervene and help our students is give them more appropriate duration and dosage of instruction. So, you know, most students in the United States these days get a 2-hour literacy block. And I wonder how many of our students are really getting that 2-hour literacy block the same way that their typically sighted peers are. And then eventually where I would like this to go is I would like to get into better brain-based learning strategies. So, you know, one of the sort of the comparison that we always make is Braille is a symbolic system and print is a symbolic system. So since they're both symbolic systems and they're both for reading, we should teach these in the same way. And we do largely teach them in the same way. With that said, I don't know if that's necessarily appropriate, you know, because these are very different skills that you're taking in through a completely, you know, they're just so different, you know. Braille requires so much more inference because of the contractions. You have to have better comprehension. You have to have better inference. There's so many things you can do when you're reading with your eyes that you can't do with your hands. You can look at the page and get so much information at a quick glance. And when you're reading with Braille, you don't know what's there until you directly touch it. So you can't get that same holistic look that you can with your eyes. So I think there might be differences in the way that we should fundamentally teach this. But in order to do that, that gets into doing brain scans. And brain scans are very difficult anytime you add movement into it. Most studies that look at fMRI and ERP and different things like that, what they'll do is they'll put all the sensors on, and then the individual has to be completely still. Otherwise, it messes up the information you're getting because you don't know if it's from the stimulus or it's from the movement. And since Braille, in order to read it, you have to move, it's been a very difficult thing to study. But eventually I would like to get there, but that's a little ways off. There's also the issue that I really don't understand neuroscience, and I've been reading stuff, but that stuff is really hard to read. So I've got a lot more reading to do. In the interim, the way that I think that we can intervene the most right now is the mechanics, duration, and dosage. And I want to start doing more work with the duration and dosage, but today we're talking about mechanics, which means the hands. Okay, so I want to take a little bit of time to go into the different types of hand movements that we're talking about when we're talking about Braille reading. So we've got two different kinds of one-handed reading. So we're going to break this down into one-handed and two-handed reading. So for the one-handed reading, you can read with either your left hand or your right hand. In that instance, one hand is reading, one hand is not doing anything useful. It might be holding the book in place, but other than that, it's not participating. We also have two-handed readers, and I'm going to show you some videos and talk through each of these. You can use your left hand as a marker. You can be a parallel reader, so your left and right hands pretty much always move together. The split the hands, the left and right hand work together till they're near the end of the line, and then the left hand drops back and finds the beginning of the next line while the right hand just keeps trucking along. And then scissors readers, some of you read in a scissors-like fashion. Their hands almost look like a pair of scissors moving across the page. And we'll go into that in a bit more detail so you really understand what we're talking about here. Well, so here's a little video of a right hand only reader.
Is it cold? Is it hot? Will we like it, Mrs. Spot?
Okay, so in that instance, you see that little boy, he's holding the book down with his left hand, but the left hand is not at all helpful for the reading process. It's just that right hand moving. I'm not going to show you a video for left hand only because it's the exact same thing, only it's the left hand doing the reading and not the right hand. Oh, no. Okay, so then after we talk about those two one-handed movements, right hand or left hand, Then we get into the two-hand method. So the first two-handed method is the least active method. So, you know, with our two-handed methods, we can put those on a continuum between most active, which means the scissors-like fashion where both hands are active pretty much every millisecond during the reading process, or the left hand read, or the right hand reads and the left hand marks, which is our least active. So you are incorporating both hands, but barely. So the left hand's going to be at the beginning of the line, just serving as a marker on that page. And then the other hand's going to read to the end of the line. The left hand's going to drop down, find the beginning of that next line. The right hand's going to join it. And then the right hand's going to go across reading. So it's helpful that you have that left hand involved because you're never losing your place and looking for it. So it saves a little time. And we're talking about milliseconds here. But once you incorporate, by incorporating that second hand, you are saving a little time. So here's a kiddo reading for you.
He looked as if he had been in a giant fire. The whole class gasped, even Keith Trotter. Keith was almost never nice to anybody.
Okay. Okay, so the next method is our first like really active two-hand method. Real fast, I see a question. I have two beginning Braille readers who only use their left hand, so what can they do with their right hands? What I would suggest in this instance where you have beginning Braille readers who are only reading with their left hand is get that right hand on a page. And the strategy we're going to be talking about right now is a parallel strategy. And this is a really great starting point for very beginning readers. Because even if you're just having that other hand follow along with the hand that's actively reading, you're getting both hands engaged. So in parallel reading, that question was perfectly timed. What you're doing is the hands are almost going to be glued together. They're going to travel across the line. They're going to drop down, find the beginning of the next line together, travel across, drop down together, travel across. And that doesn't seem like that's very efficient because, you know, the hands are traveling together at all times. But the thing is, parallel readers progress to become split readers. And so I think this is probably the best starting point for most beginning Braille readers.
Dan and Beth ate and then they played some more. Before long, it was time to go.
Okay, and this little girl, when she was reading that passage, she's in the first grade. And I'm just going to play that again because I want you to watch how fluidly her hands are moving. You can't hear the passage very well. Some of these are really cute to hear. Some of these are a little bit more nebulous. This one's a little bit harder to hear. But what I really want you to watch is the way her hands are moving. By the way, this student did not flag in the ABC Braille study as being one of the fastest readers because that was a longitudinal study. So we added kids in kindergarten, and then the next year when those kids were in first grade, we kept those kiddos and then we added more kids. So by the end of the study, our oldest kids were in fourth grade and our youngest kiddos were in first grade. So this kiddo joined the study late. So because she was only in first grade when the study ended, we did not flag her as a super fast reader. This student, I happen to know who this student is because she used to be a student I worked with a bazillion years ago. My goodness, the student I'm sure is in high school or out of high school by now. But she actually went on to win her age group in the Braille Challenge, the National Braille Challenge, a couple of years in a row. So this student went on to become a phenomenal reader.
Dan and Beth ate and then they.
And you can see at this super young age, she's just got this beautiful light touch. Her fingers are lightly cupped. They're just slowly like very fluidly flowing across the page. It's a beautiful to watch her read. Yeah, somebody, Amanda made the comment, I thought she read really well and was not halting or trying to sound things out. Yeah. And this is a little girl who actually just loved to read at home. She didn't have the world's best home life, but she was an avid reader. She spent all of her spare time in her room reading. So she was really, in a lot of ways, just sort of self-taught to be an amazing reader because she practiced so much and just loved reading so much.
Yeah.
Okay, split method. That is the next step in this progression of efficiency. And even though the parallel readers aren't trucking along as fast as these readers, keep in mind that parallel sets you up to move on to this progression. And this is a progression that happens pretty naturally. You don't necessarily have to teach it. We can teach it to be more efficient, but this is just going to be sort of a natural progression from that parallel as your students become more fluent readers.
Say that it's been easier than usual to keep the place tidy with you down in the basement all the time. But, Papa, what are we to do for money? What is the trouble? Asked Mr. Popper.
Okay, so I'm not sure if you could hear that super well, but you can tell she's got great comprehension because she's got great prosody. She's doing the different character voices. I love at the end how she does the male character's voice. What is the trouble? So she's a really good reader, and you see that in that. Her hands, they start out on the first line together. When they get about the halfway point of that first line, the left hand drops down and begins looking for that beginning of the next line while she continues reading. So it's not like that left hand marks, right hand reads where the left hand's marking and only doing that periodic work. The hand is like, while the right hand is reading, the left hand is dropping down and getting prepped to read that next line. So that increases the efficiency. Once again, we're talking about milliseconds, but if you do that over and over and over, it really speeds you up. So let's take one more second and watch that again.
Say that it's
So
been
together,
easier than usual to keep the place tidy with you down in the basement
and
all
so
the time.
you can see for about the last quarter of the
what
line,
are
the
we
right hand is continuing to
do for
read while the
money?
left hand is jumping over. And you can see how
What is
this
the
still
trouble?
sort of looks
Asked Mr. Popper. Say that
a lot like the parallel method. It's just a little bit faster. So it's a very natural progression. And then this next one, I'll warn you, is not actually a perfect example at all of the scissors method. Is there a space between lines? That's a good question. Let's jump back real fast.
say that it's been easier than usual to keep.
It looks like there is not a space between lines on this. What we did for these passages is we had the students read a passage that they had read before, so we wouldn't run into issues with unknown vocabulary, but something that they didn't have memorized. So there wasn't a standardized passage that the students read. But this scissors-like fashion is not a perfect example of one because this is still a beginning Braille reader. This is actually, the split Braille reader was a little girl in the 3rd grade. And this is her again when she's in 4th grade. And you can see how her hand movements have progressed. So what you do in a scissor method, it's similar to split in that on the first line, you would probably go about halfway with the hands. And then the right hand keeps trucking and reading as the left hand drops down. What makes the difference with the scissor method is the left hand starts reading while the right hand finishes the line above. So it's like, it's not that two hands are reading at the exact same time, but it's almost like two hands are reading at the exact same time. And so the hands sort of meet in the middle, and as you progress down the page, you kind of look like a pair of scissors. Once again, this is still a beginning Braille reader, so she's not a perfect scissors reader, but you still see that progression from that split method.
First lesson, Transfiguration, that drove the Chamber of Secrets out of their minds for the first time in weeks. 10 minutes into the class, Professor McGonagall told them that their
So if you remember on that split pattern, she was splitting her hands toward the very end, like the last quarter. And she's splitting it closer to the halfway point or the 2/3 mark. So, once again, we're just talking about a millisecond of change. But once again, if you have a millisecond of time savings between every word, it adds up. By the way, if you guys, I can definitely run this again.
First lesson, Transfiguration, that drove the Chamber of Secrets out of their minds for the first time in weeks. 10 minutes into the class, Professor McGonagall told them that their exams.
So it's all about that progression of fluidity. Yes, Stephanie, I saw that you made the comment about it being fun to see this clip. A lot of this is going to be familiar for you because I'm still kind of obsessed with the same topic. Stephanie was an invaluable part of the ABC Braille research team.
First lesson.
Okay, so those are the basic patterns I'm talking about when I talk about hand movement patterns. So let's talk about some characteristics. So we're going to talk about scrubbing. So scrubbing is when you see the finger or a hand going up and down on the Braille. It's really hard to show this when I'm not really like this. It would be like that. But scrubbing is that up and down motion. And what that really tells you is it's a character recognition issue. If you see somebody who's doing a lot of scrubbing, that's usually an issue with just they don't have the level of character recognition for fluency that we would ideally like them to have. Regressions. So regressions are little jump backs. It can be with just the pinky, it can be with one hand, it can be with both hands. Sometimes it's just a single little jump back, sometimes it's a multiple jump back. Your eyes do the exact same thing when you read. They're little saccades, little jump backs. And this is what I talk about, how I have no clue what my eyes are doing when I'm reading. This is I think one of the best ways that we can capitalize on efficiency when it comes to hand movements. We'll talk about that more later. Pauses. Pauses are if you just are pausing for whatever reason. It might be because this person's sounding out a word. It might be because they're trying to get some of that context that is so necessary when you're reading Braille with the contractions. Searching motions. A searching motion could be something like you lost your place on the page and you're trying to find your place again, but it also could be a search for information. You know, how much longer do I have till the end of this sentence? How much longer is this paragraph? Do the words go all the way down to the bottom of the page, or do they stop halfway on the page? All of that is valuable information to reading that print readers get at just a quick glance at the page, but our student has to do an active search and touch to find out that information. Erratic movements, that's anything that didn't pertain to reading. It could be that the student was playing with the binding of their book. It could be that the student was scratching their nose or flipping the edge of their paper because they were kind of bored, whatever. And then just normal reading, although we don't code normal reading because it's funny because you have very few moments of just quote unquote normal reading. Okay, so part 2. Now that we've sort of talked about why this is important, and it does have to do with reading speed, but like I said, I wanted us to keep in mind that this really is a bigger picture thing. It's not just about reading speed. It's about making sure that our students have a fighting chance in a world that isn't always up for giving people extra chances. So let's talk about how we can work with the mechanics to really have an impact in that area. So I just want to plead my case for why 2 hands matter. I can't tell you how many times I've talked about this and people are like, oh, but my student really only wants to use one hand. And you know what? Can your students still have a full and wonderful life and be a one-handed Braille reader? Yes, they can. Absolutely. I am not here to condemn anyone to anything. Helen Keller was a one-handed Braille reader, primarily because she would read with one hand so someone could interpret into her other hand, and she would have that free for interpreting and talking. But anyway, I do think for the vast majority of people, if you have the ability to get 2 hands on a page, that is the single biggest thing you can do to help your student when it comes to the mechanics of Braille reading. So if we look at some of the old data from the ABC Braille, we see that, for just as an example, our 4th grade readers, our fastest reading speed was 91 words per minute, and that student was using a scissor method. The next fastest reading speed was 66.5 words per minute. That student was using a split method. And the 3rd fastest reading speed was 65.8 words per minute. And that student was using a parallel method. When you look at the slowest reading speeds, they were ranged from 7.3 words per minute in 4th grade. And these are kids that if these kiddos had any additional diagnosed disabilities, they were eliminated from the study. So none of these kids are supposedly have anything else that's preventing them from reading at the same rate as their peers other than the medium. Now, that doesn't mean some of these kiddos didn't have other struggles or other disabilities that weren't diagnosed, but 7.3 words per minute to 37.8 words per minute. We had very few one-handed readers in the study. Most kids were using 2 hands, at least in some form. But 2 of our students that were one-handed readers were our slowest and next to slowest reader. And then the reader that after that was 37.8 words per minute and was using a parallel method. And I just wanted to point out that in this particular study, the fastest any one-handed reader got was 54.5 words per minute. So that was 5th out of 9. So still, you know, coming in that bottom half. We have more data on this. I'm just not showing you all the data we have on it since it's not brand new data. But when you see this trend over and over and over of our 2-handed readers reading more quickly than our one-handed readers, to me, that makes a really strong case for let's try to get 2 hands on the page if possible. This is just a sort of another view of the same type of thing. So what we did here is we looked at how did students begin reading. In our first clips that we have of these students when they were in kindergarten, what hand movement pattern were they using and how did that progress over time? And I know a few minutes ago, Amanda's question asked, you know, how as they get older and the content is more difficult to understand, what kind of impact does that have? And this is going to be a place for us to really talk about that. Okay, I see a good question. I'm going to jump back to that in just a second. Okay, so we had 2 right hand only readers. One of those continued on as a right hand only reader throughout the study, never incorporated that second hand. Now, does that mean that the student never incorporated the second hand? These data are kind of old now, so maybe the student did at some point, but in the data we had, and we had 5 years of data, we just, we didn't go past 3 years because we didn't have data for everybody and we didn't want the numbers to be skewed. But, you know, we didn't have, in those 5 years of data, we didn't have students that became 2 active 2-hand readers. This one student did incorporate that left hand as a marking hand, which is good, but that's not one of those 2-handed methods that naturally progresses to more efficient methods. We had 2 left hand only readers, neither of them ever incorporated that second hand. So, you know, this is very small data, but, you know, just this questions I've asked over the years, I do find that most students who start with one hand don't typically ever incorporate that second hand. Now, Kelly had asked the question, what do you do when you get an older student, like middle school or high school, that is a one-handed readers? Do you attempt to change their mechanics? And I would say it depends. If this student is a one-handed reader and they are averaging, you know, I would say at least 150, 200 words per minute of silent reading with comprehension, you probably don't need to do too much to intervene. But if they're reading significantly slower than that, I would probably try to go second hand on the page. It might be a little bit of a painful transition, but I think it would probably pay off. But that's, you know, that's just my educated opinion on that. We don't know for sure. We had our students that started as parallel readers. We had 15 students who started out as parallel readers. 3 of those changed to a left hand marks, right hand reads strategy, which I would consider a less efficient, slightly less efficient 2-handed reading method. It is still 2-handed, but this was a decision by their TVI. These 3 students had the same TVI who was a big proponent of starting the students with left hand marks, right hand reads. So this was actually something that the teacher made them do or encouraged them to do or required them to do. But of our students who started out as parallel readers, 15 of those continued on as parallel readers the next year, and then the following year, they were 6 were still primarily parallel readers, but 4 had progressed to a split pattern. Two of those students by first grade were in using a split method in our sample. And then in the next year, we see that one went back to parallel and one went to split. And this goes exactly to the question that Kelly asked, I think it was Kelly, about, oh no, it was Amanda asking about as the content gets more difficult. It is completely dependent on what type of content you're reading, whether or not you'll be in this parallel, split, or scissors pattern. And I want to keep in mind that you're not just in one pattern. As you saw, like the parallel method and the split method and the scissor method, while they're distinct differences, they are sort of a continuation of each other. It's the same basic method, but they're spreading their hands further apart and each hand is becoming more autonomous as you go. And so if you're reading something that's lighthearted, like I have an affinity for celebrity gossip, I don't know why I feel the need to read this crap, but I do. And I can read it very quickly. I can read it at a glance. I read that very differently than when I'm reading my, like these neuroscience journals that I try to read to get a better understanding of brain-based learning strategies. Those are pretty painful to read sometimes, you know, so I'm sure my eyes are doing something different. And our students that are Braille readers are the same. But the thing is, our students who start with that parallel strategy are more likely to when they revert back to a less efficient pattern of parallel as opposed to a less efficient pattern of becoming a single-handed reader. So they're still in a position so that they can jump ahead when they get to parts of the text that are easier. So you are going to see this. And as we were doing this, we were collecting data every 6 seconds and recording what the primary hand movement pattern was for that interval of 6 seconds. And then at the end, we would see how many intervals were that were parallel, how many intervals that were split, how many intervals were scissor, or right hand only, or left hand only, or whatever. And that's how we categorize people. So when I'm saying there's a split method, that means that was their predominant pattern. It doesn't mean it was the only pattern they used. Is scissors faster than left hand marks and split? Great question. I would say it's more efficient. I don't know that it's always faster, but I think it has the potential to be much faster. There's sort of a limited speed you can get to with each of the patterns. So just because you're using that faster pattern doesn't mean that you necessarily will be faster, but it means you have the capacity to get faster, if that sort of makes sense. Okie doke. Okay, and you see the same thing with the split. We had one student that went back to a left hand marks, right hand reads method, but others continued on, jumped back to parallel, but once again, that's still just a continuation. And we have our student who went from being a split reader to a split reader to a scissors reader. Okay, so that's some of the reasons why I think it's so important to get 2 hands on a page. And that's some of our older data. So let's pause real quick. I see a couple of comments in the chat box. Let me read through those real quickly. And let's talk about those things. And then let's move on to some of the current research we're doing and some strategies. Okay, got a comment from Mia. You're right, these 2 Braille readers of mine started learning Braille several years ago. I wasn't the Braille teacher back then, and we had a Category 5 hurricane that hit you in October of 2018. That sounds awful. And you were out of work and school for a few months, and the boys had to go to another school. Sharing a classroom was sharing a classroom. Last year, one boy went to a private school and the other just, yeah. So yeah, it can be really challenging to get both hands on the page. I think that the biggest strategy is to use a behavioral approach. I'm really big on positive reinforcement and working with behavioral specialists to come up with behavior plans to really enforce 2 hands on the page. Don't feel like you have to do it on your own. This is an IEP team goal, and I think you really can recruit other professionals to help you with this. Another question from Amanda. If you have an older student who is learning to read Braille for the first time, oh, we already talked about that. Are there subtle differences from right-handers and left-handers with these methods? I'm not 100% sure. That's a a really good question. I've never explored the difference between the two types of one-handed readers, but we now have a mechanism for understanding them better. So that is a really good question from you, Miriam. And that leads us perfectly into this next part. So I want to talk a little bit more about the current research that Rob, Will Emerson, and I have ongoing. So what are we doing now? So what we did to analyze the hand movements from the ABC Braille study is we largely relied on visual analysis because that's what we had the ability to do. So like I said, we had these videos, and basically what I spent an entire summer doing was watching each of these videos over and over and over with a beep tape that Diane had made with a cassette tape and by pushing a button on her microwave. So, and she had a stopwatch. So every 6 seconds she would push a button on her microwave, and she was recording it on a cassette tape. So that tells you how far technology has come. But what we're doing is we're trying to get a deeper look of our participants. So what we did was we recruited 18 adults, and our original plan was we wanted to find the average reading speed for a fluent adult, which I've got some questions about these numbers now, but the long-standing data has been that the average fluent adult reader reads at about 300 words per minute when they're reading silently, and about 150 words per minute when they're reading orally. So our original plan was to find 10 adult readers who fall into that fast category, which would be above 150 words per minute, and then 10 participants who fell into that slower category or below that 150 words per minute. That did not actually work out because we did not find nearly enough participants that were reading above 150 words per minute. But so anyway, we recruited these people in, and we did a survey with them. We asked them questions about how they read. Do they read with one or two hands? Which fingers are primarily do the reading? And ask them, because I want to get a sense of how much do people know about what their hands are doing when they read? Do they really know what their hands are doing? Or are they like most of us who read print visually, where you don't really know what your eyes are doing? They just do it. We gave them 6 different passages across 3 different conditions. Or there's 6 conditions, but 3 comparisons we were really doing. So each passage, they had 5 minutes to read. When they got to the 5-minute point, we stopped, because if they were reading like 7 words per minute, we didn't want to make them struggle through 3 pages of Braille, because that would be painful for everyone. The conditions we had an easy and hard comparison. For the easy hard comparison, we took a passage about Stonehenge that I think is probably pulled from the Johns. I don't recall at this moment, but it's just a basic 4th grade level passage. The hard condition was a passage taken from Walden by Thoreau. It's a 12th grade reading passage. The reason we use these particular passages is because these are considered standardized and graded, and the iBraille Challenge app and Reading Adventure Time used some of these passages. So we have data on children. And so at some point when I get through all these data, I'm going to be able to do some comparisons between reading speeds of children and adults with these. So that'll be nice. But we did the easy hard condition. We had a condition that looked at refreshable Braille display and paper Braille to see what the differences were when they were moving their hands that way. Because with a refreshable Braille display, you only have one line of text. And so that necessarily has a big impact on how you're reading. And then our last condition was Nemeth and a worksheet in math, like about a 4th grade level linear problem, addition, subtraction worksheet in both Nemeth and in full UEB, because we wanted to see how people were reading differently on those. And just as a sidebar, that doesn't actually have anything to do with hand mechanics, but I will just sort of tell you, we had several people who were like, oh no, I can't read the UEB math. I've never learned UEB, because these were adults. And I will say that most of those people who threw that reaction up did just as well, if not better, on the UEB passage than they did on the Nemeth. And keep in mind, this was just simple addition, subtraction, problems written in linear fashion, so it's definitely not a be all end all, but I did think that was really interesting. We were able to compare those two. Video recording. So we recorded these people in a similar manner to what we did with the children and the clips that I showed you. And then we used Rob's OptiTrack. So what is an OptiTrack? Oh, and now we're in the process of analyzing the data. Real fast as we transition to the next one, I just want to say that, is it Charla made a comment about you can't imagine doing this with, but because you're left-handed and you can't imagine pulling your right hand across the page just as fast as people who are right-hand dominant. This is an interesting topic. We don't really know a whole lot about the role that hand dominance plays in it. However, in the ABC Braille study, we did look at that as a variable, and there's a separate paper that I wrote that was published in 2009, and I found that hand dominance did not have a statistically significant correlation with the way that people move their hands. So I think you can definitely do it completely ambidextrously, but I don't know that for sure. We only have one study to go off of there. So this is the OptiTrack that Rob has that we're using. It's basically a $50,000 camera. It's a really fancy camera that can get data on the X, Y, and Z axis really fast. So we're using this instead of just visual analysis. We are still doing visual analysis because we're sort of using the visual analysis methods that we've used in the past as a baseline way of knowing. And then we're using this really hyper detailed information that we're getting from Rob's fancy machine to give us more specific data. And we're trying to actually come up with a quantitative definition of what a parallel reader looks like versus a split reader. We're still trying to figure out exactly how to do this, but we're working on it. Okay, this is what our readers looked like. Okay, so right here, a lot of you are probably thinking, what the heck? How is somebody supposed to read with all that crap on their hands? And that is a very valid critique of this work. It is a limitation. These were a little clunky, but we did make every effort to position these sensors, because you have to have these little marker lights everywhere that you want to collect data. This was the least obtrusive way we could come up with doing it. Like I said, it's clunky. There's no way around it. But I will say most people said it didn't impact them nearly as much as they thought it would. There were a couple of times when like one of these sensor boxes would fall off the table and we would have to like help somebody get it back on, or, you know, so there were a couple of times it did impact reading speed, and I'm sure it did have an impact on hand movements, but I think it was less of an impact than you might think at first glance. So we had one of these marker lights. These two at the top of the Braille page were just to let the OptiTrack know where the Braille page was. We did have to tape the page to the table so that it would have a consistent placement and we would get consistent data. And then the marker lights were positioned just below the fingernail. So it's just sort of on this part of the finger. We did that there so that it wouldn't get in the way any more than it had to. What we did was use two-sided tape so there was nothing obscuring the finger pad, and then we taped the wires just so they didn't get all tangled and make it harder to read. We taped the wires to the fingers. Whereas with the visual analysis, every 6 seconds we coded which pattern we had predominantly seen. With this, we are getting data in 3 dimensions 20 times per second. So we've got a lot more data. So instead of having 1 data point, we've got 180 data points, and we've got them on the X, Y, and Z axis. So this is just an example of an adult reader. Once again, this adult is using a combination of parallel, split, and scissors as their methods.
The heel stone placed a little distance from the main structure. The sun rises directly over the heel stone on the summer or winter solstice. The summer solstice is the longest day of the year. The winter solstice is the shortest day of the year. Today, people meet on those dates to celebrate the mystery of ancient Stonehenge.
So you see, like as she's reading, unlike even the clip I used as an example of a young reader that's approaching a scissors pattern, this reader, her hands are so far apart so much of the time when she's reading. They come together, but they're working so actively apart from each other. And I want you to compare that with a reader like this. Oh, no, where is it? Okay, yeah, so here's, 1 second, I'm gonna go forward just a little bit because, okay, yeah, there it is. That's the video I want you to compare it with. Just wanted to make sure it was in here. Okay, so what we're able to see with this, so the minimum distance of her index fingers, so we're looking at the distance between them. And keep in mind, this isn't just horizontal. We're looking at horizontal distances, vertical distances, and that third dimension of distance, that x-axis. So, or I mean the z-axis. So the minimum distance between the fingers was 4.6, but the max distance was 252.55. The average distance between her index fingers is 63. And I think that this is a really important measure because this is telling us how, on average, how much of the time are the fingers working separately as opposed together. And I think this is, like I said, this is a completely new way of looking at it. So we're still figuring out exactly what these numbers mean. But what I think is the higher this number is, this mean distribution index, the more time your hands are working independently. And that could be a measure of how fast or how efficient you are up to a point, but it could end up being a measure that drops down because if you're a scissor reader and your hands are really far apart most of the time, that's going to give you a pretty high number. But if you're a one-handed reader, or if you're like a left hand marks, right hand reads reader, you're going to have a lot of distance between your hands a lot of the time too. So, you know, I think that having that higher number there is going to make the difference, is going to give us some really valuable information, but I'm not exactly sure how to ferret that out yet. We're still working on it. This is a work in progress. And then this is the root mean square index of the y-axis. And I'll be completely honest with you, Rob would have to explain to you what that means, because when you start talking about things like root mean square, that's a little too numbery, even for me, and I love numbers. So comparing two participants, you know, just sort of looking at the differences between the index fingers. You know, this is an example. This person has a negative number. Rob says that we should ignore the negatives because that doesn't mean that the hands were overlapping. But, you know, so like just consider all these numbers positive. So this person had an average of 52 between the index fingers. This person had an average of 4. Their maximum distance index, that's very far apart. I'm going to assume that this number somewhere around 250 is probably the length of the line, because that's what we're seeing consistently as people's max distance. And when it comes to the average distance, once again, we see a very different number between this person whose fingers are apart a lot of the time with an average distance of 130, and then this other person whose hands were closer together most of the time. So what we're doing in this data, we're looking for patterns in these data so we can create these quantitative, more firm, less squishy definitions. But what we're also doing with this is we're taking variables like words per minute, how many miscues people have, what types of miscues people have, different things like that. And we're looking for correlations to say, how do these specific hand movements impact things like reading speed and the number of miscues and things like that? Or is there no correlation? So that's the kind of stuff we're looking at in this study. Once again, these are just comparisons within a reader, and you can see differences in how they're reading. So when they're reading an easy passage, their average, their the minimum, well, let's ignore the minimum for a second. The average, when they're reading an easy passage, the distribution is about 130. When they read the difficult passage, it was exactly the same, almost exactly the same. When we did the UEB and the refreshable Braille display, you see that the average distance is exactly the same. When we're seeing the Nemeth and the UEB, we see a little bit of a difference. The average distance between the index fingers went from 77 to 72. So this is key information, because we know that when they're reading like literary passages, they're reading them very, very similarly. Regardless of what the condition is. And we're seeing a lot of similarities in how they're reading on the basic pattern on Braille and refreshable Braille. And that's really helpful to know, because we need to make decisions for our fluent readers, but we also need to make decisions for beginning Braille readers. So having information about how this changes our hand movements gives us better information about what our starting point should be when it comes to technology. No firm recommendations from this yet, but this is what we're working on. And you guys can help us if you have any insights into these data and you're like, oh, I bet this. Feel free to share that with us. We always love it. But what this tells me, this preliminary data that Rob and I are still kind of sussing through, is mechanics really do matter. So I mentioned joint attention earlier. So if you think about it, you can hold two different things in different hands. So if I hold a pencil in my left hand and a water bottle in my right hand, I can feel both items at the same time. My hands are working at the exact same time. When I'm reading print, my eyes can't do that. I can't have my left eye do one thing and my right hand do another thing, or my right eye do another thing. I can't split my eyes and make them work. We can do that with Braille, and that's one of the things I really want to capitalize on. Because of joint attention, I can be taking in information with my left hand and my right hand, different information at the same time. And Diane Ormsley was the one who really figured this out. And the way she figured it out is one of her very first jobs, even before she was a certified TBI. She was working as an English teacher at the School for the Blind in upstate New York. And what she realized her students were doing, some of her students, was they would be reading, they would have like their reading book that they were supposed to be reading for class on their desk, and they would be reading along, following along. Meanwhile, inside their desk, they would have a comic book, and they would be reading their comic book with their other hand. And that was when Diane first realized you really can read with both hands, essentially at the same time. Like I said, it's not exactly what you're doing, but for our intents and purposes, they were reading two different things with their hands at the same time. And that's what we need to know. Because since you can tactually discriminate with both hands simultaneously, that also means that very fast readers are using both hands and multiple fingers for different tasks simultaneously. So just because I have spent so many years staring at people's hands when they read Braille, I have a couple of theories. I think that the left pinky plays a very important role in Braille reading. I think that it sort of helps people review. Because Braille is so contextual, I think that people who are really good Braille readers have a tendency to use their left pinky to sort of jump back, whether they're aware of it or not, and sort of review things that they've already read to make sure that that context was correct. Because I see a lot of people doing this. I also see a lot of people with their right fingers jumping out. I think that's a lot of times sort of a reconnaissance mission. I think that this finger is sort of jumping out to obtain information that might be related to context. If nothing else, I think it's getting information about what is coming up. How much longer do I have in this line? When do I need to drop my other hand down to find the beginning of the next line? You know, where am I in space? And so I want to show you, like, let's go back for a second. let's go back to this video. I want you to watch her. No. Sorry, guys. I'm going AWOL on myself. Okay, so I want you, I gotta learn not to change the plan. So right here, I want you to look at the left pinky and the right pinky to sort of see that review and that reconnaissance mission that I'm talking about.
First lesson, Transfiguration, that drove the Chamber of Secrets out of their minds for the first time in weeks. 10 minutes into the class, Professor McGonagall told them that their exams...
Okay, let's do that again. I'm gonna pause it.
Transfiguration.
Okay, she put her pinky down, and it's really hard to catch in that moment, but when she does, she puts it down for the end of the page, which to a certain extent is just, I think, an ergonomic thing. She's just putting her pinky down, and that's probably in the perfect clip to notice it in. But when her pinky goes down, it checks to see where the end of that line is, and then she adjusts her hand based on that. I think that our Braille readers are doing a lot more of those subtle things when they're reading than they realize. And with her, you can't see her left pinky jumping back, but when you watch it, you see that most of her regressions are made at least with this left hand. So anytime you're doing a regression with that left pinky, that's great, because then you've still got 4 fingers that are moving ahead, and you've got a whole nother hand that's moving ahead. But even if you do that jump back with your entire left hand, or if you're only reading with your like index finger or your index and middle finger the way she is, whenever you do that jump back, if you just do it with the left hand, that right hand is still making forward progress. So once again, we're talking about saving milliseconds, but every millisecond counts when it comes to reading speed. So I'll let you finish this so you can sort of see how she's doing those regressions with that left hand.
That drove the Chamber of Secrets out of their minds for the first time in weeks. 10 minutes into the class, Professor McGonagall told them that their exams...
Sue made the observation that her index fingers are tilted. They sure are. I don't know why she reads like that. I don't know if she always does it or if she only happened to do it in our clip. And I want you to see the difference in this. So this is an example of somebody who's scrubbing a lot. This is actually a comparison between a child and an adult, but I really want you to see the difference in how efficient the first passage hand movements were and how inefficient these are.
You may begin.
In Great Britain, there is a circle of...
So if you see, her finger is just up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. This is somebody that if I was working with her, if I only had 5 minutes to diagnose where I should start instruction with her, which would be a terrible situation to be in, because you should always do a really thorough analysis before you jump into things. But with this person, I think that I would probably go back to Mangold materials or Mangold type materials and just work on character recognition. So much scrubbing. This person's never going to be able to progress to efficient hand movements until they're better at character recognition. So that's what I really wanted to show you with that. So this is why mechanics matter.
First lesson.
Okay, and we are almost out of time. I never get to everything I want to get to. So I'm going to go through a couple of these things and give you a bit of an overview, but then I'm also going to take just a second to point out some extra materials you have in your handouts so you can do some of this work at home, because I knew we wouldn't get to everything I wanted to. Okay, so what my sort of next step is I've sort of been toying with like basically a form or a tool I can put together to help people be detectives. Because I think the mechanics of how we read Braille are really important. Otherwise, I wouldn't be studying them for years. But it's only a piece of the puzzle. So I think the big thing we need to do when we're working with students is to really become detectives. And the third part of this presentation that we're not going to go into tons of detail on, but you have lots of resources to help you with, are sort of the things I'm thinking about when it comes to this tool. Right now, I'm sort of thinking like the first thing that comes to mind to call something this tool is like Diagnostics of Reading in Braille, but then I realized that the acronym would be DRAB, which is probably the worst name anybody has ever created for a tool. So this is the DRAB tool, or the DRAB, that is still in my mind and will be called something much flashier at some point. But I think when we're looking at Braille, we really need to make a concerted effort to look at speed. I think we need to look at accuracy, which is miscues, which involves coding miscues and coding Braille miscues. I'm going to jump back to that for just a second as we wrap up. Prosody, we talked about that. Even before I ever do a measure of comprehension, I know that that student who was reading to us a little bit earlier, who did the what is the trouble? She has great comprehension because you don't have prosody like that without good comprehension. Comprehension can also be measured in different ways. So I think that's an important thing to look at because you can definitely have comprehension without prosody. It's hard to have prosody without comprehension. And then I think the big thing that we can forget about, but it's very important not to forget about, is attitude and enjoyment when it comes to this for our students. Because the big thing is if our students aren't reading, they're never going to become stronger Braille readers. One of the tools that I provided in your handout is related to accuracy. And if you look in your handout or if you look at it later, one of the things you're going to see is a tool for coding miscues like you would on the Johns. And then there's a second tool that shows you how to code Braille miscues. And we definitely don't have time to go into that. But the reason I think that this is so important to sort of tease out what type of miscues people are making is it that they don't understand phonemes, is it that they don't understand digraphs or trigraphs. Because if that's the case, this is really an issue for the classroom teacher, the reading specialist. You're going to work with those professionals, but it's not squarely in your court. If the student keeps missing a dot, perhaps because they have their index fingers tilted when they're reading the Braille, if they're missing dots when they're reading, and instead of saying, they're saying the word in instead of picking up that something is an S, or, you know, if they think something is an I instead of an S, then that is missing dots. So, you know, you want to be able to figure out what those differences are, because if the problem is the student is missing dots, there's nobody that can rectify that situation except for the teacher of students with visual impairments. So this is one of the things I'm hoping to do in the future, is to come up with a tool that really sort of helps you through this. And the handouts have lots of examples of how to go through and what would be a miscue and what would be a Braille miscue, and what are those examples of the different types of Braille miscues. Because when you know what types of mistakes and errors your student's making, you can do a much better job of intervening. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up here. I see one more question that I'll talk about real fast. I see a question. Can you please review the differences between reading UEB math and Nemeth one more time? You want to make sure that you heard me correctly. Be really careful about sharing this because this is preliminary data. But right now, we just anecdotally, because I haven't coded all of the data specifically yet. We're working on that right now. I just was working on that this morning. But just anecdotally speaking, a lot of people were very much like, oh, you can't give me a UEB worksheet. I've never read UEB. I don't have training in UEB. I can't do this. But we found that more people struggled when they were reading the Nemeth sheet than the UEB sheet. But once again, these were just linear addition, subtraction problems at about a 4th grade level. Should we have pre-readers use mangled sheets to find symbols in left hand, right hand? Yes, great. I love that. I love mangled sheets for everything. Really, really important to teach some of those basic skills like tracking and character recognition and things like that. Can you remind me what prosody means? Prosody is when you read with expression. So our little girl that was reading with character voices and, you know, ending a question with a high-pitched voice at the end, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about prosody. These are good questions. Okay. So that brings us about to the end of our time. So I guess, does anybody have last minute questions? Liz, do you have anything last minute?
I don't see any other thing. Somebody had their hand raised, but I think they lowered it. So I wanted to make sure that if they did have a question, they could type it in the chat. But we are going to, if you do have any more detailed questions or you want to have more discussion with Tess, we're going to have her in our debriefing meeting room, which will be at 4 o'clock. And that is a separate Zoom link where you'll be able to have your cameras and your microphones on so you can actually interact and talk and all that good stuff. But yes, I see some people saying this is interesting, this is so fascinating, and I agree, this is very fascinating stuff. Just thinking about, especially when you're saying with the hand movements, that yes, if you're reading something harder that takes more mental effort, you are probably going to slow down, just like we do when we're reading something very technical. It's like, oh, how many times do I have to reread that before I understand this? So yeah, this is so interesting, and I think really helpful for people to remember the importance of our two hands. get them both on there. Yeah, and also I will just say we in Florida we're a big state. So if you're ever looking for a large number of students who read Braille, I am sure you could come to Florida and find enough students to participate in any future studies. So I'll
Oh, you just opened yourselves up for the next study.
just
No, I will say seriously, if anybody who found this interesting, I will be here around from 4 to 4:30, but I'm also just always happy to talk about this stuff. I'm super easy to find. It's just tessa.m@pitt.edu. I'll type it in the chat box. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. I love it.
Awesome. And I'm going to quickly just throw the briefing room link in the chat so people have that. And then I will do our housekeeping for the end here. So I'll share my screen again. Okay, so thank you all for joining us. And for joining us, we would ask that you do this survey for us. If I can advance my slides. So if you've done this before, you know it's 4 very short, simple questions that the Florida Department of Education has us give out, and then we report the results back to them, and we use that information to show that we are meeting your needs or if there's something we need to be doing differently. But there is a QR code there. There is a bit.ly, which is FIMC-eval, and that survey link is always on our events page of our website, FIMC-VI.org. So if you would please take a minute or two to do that, we really appreciate it. So I'll leave that there for just a moment if anyone wants to grab that QR code. And so yes, people are still saying in the chat, thank you, awesome and fascinating. Good luck with your research. Okay, and so for our closing code, if you're looking for that in-service and or ACB or AP credit, is PINKY. PINKY. As we learned today that our pinkies have something to do too. We don't want to leave any of our friends out of this really hard work of reading Braille. So you're going to get that opening code. Beth, I'll give you all the opening code here too, which was scissors. That should make sense at this point. So you're going to take those 2 codes and put them in the form with the different QR code here and our other links that we have. You'll fill that form out and make sure you use your correct email address, and a certificate will be emailed back to you. If you don't receive a certificate within a day of submitting that form, then email myself or anyone at FIMC and we'll sort that out and get your certificate to you. But so that form is the bit.ly of FIMC-CEUs, or the survey is always, I'm sorry, that form is always on our events page as well. So you can always reach out to us. There's our address and our contact information. So from here, we're going to be taking a 30-minute break. And then if you would like to join us at 2:30, Lucia Hasty is going to be presenting on teaching tactile graphics. She did some sessions for us over the summer that were also related to tactile graphics, and those were actually on the creation of tactile graphics, but this will be focusing on how to teach students to interpret and use tactile graphics. So we hope you find that helpful. And then right after Lucia's session ends at 4, that's when we'll all head to that debriefing room for anyone who wants to have a more in-depth conversation. So that is all we have for now. And thank you so much again, Tess, for that fabulous presentation. I'm so grateful that everything worked out and you were able to join us and do that presentation for us, because I know everything's chaotic nowadays, but that worked out really well.
We love technology when it works. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Thanks to everybody who came. I really appreciate it.
Yes, exactly. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to kick you out so you can go and take your 30-minute break, and we'll see you later.